Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holowchak. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher and historian, um, author of over 70 published books and 5 books on Ukraine recently. That's where my attention is being turned. And today I want to share my thoughts with you on the war in Ukraine. Specifically, I suspect or I suggest that there's a sort of chess match going on between two prominently large egos, Donald J. Trump and Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. And following the war as closely as I can, there are several different moves I find intriguing. Um, I've always thought that Putin has no genuine interest in coming to the negotiations table. And why do I say that? He's paid lip service to that on several occasions, of course. But why do I say that? He has nothing to gain by true negotiation. If by negotiation we mean let's come to the table, throw out one side, throw out what they want, the other side, throw out what they want, and then work towards some sort of reconciliation. I want to talk about what reconciliation would entail, because I think essentially any sort of reconciliation would be a losing proposition for Ukraine and a losing proposition for the Western world. And I'll explain that as I go along. Um, First, if we play out the notion of chess match, we need to say something about the players. Who is Donald Trump, and what does Trump bring to the table? What sort of person is Donald Trump? I think what Trump brings to the table, that's an asset, or his assets are his technology. He's a lover of power. He's obsessed with power. He also, that's the main thing, right? He also understands that you have to deal with Putin via strength. You can't sit back and worry about his constant threats, i.e., nuclear threats and things to that end. He's had several occasions to use nuclear weapons, and he's not done it thus far. Notice how his threats about using nuclear weapons diminish as each day goes on. It was suggested to me, watching one video on YouTube, that Putin would never use nukes. And I think this is a fairly cogent argument, and I'll say why. Putin is obsessed. He sees himself as a smaller version. I say that literally. He's 5'6", and Peter the Great might have been 6'8", at least in some accounts. Some people think he was that tall. So he is a diminutive. He's a small Peter, if you want to call him that, pun intended. And he is obsessed with military victory, military conquest. Conquest has always been in the history of Russia. It occupies 1/6 of the global world, as we know. And if you follow Russia from its roots when Moscow was just a village, right? Back, just past the demise of Kiev Rus, right, in 1240 or so, when the Mongols came in and decimated a large part of it. Russians have been obsessed, the tsars and emperors and presidents and so forth, with acquisition of land. And over the centuries, you see how Russia has developed into a very land-rich nation. And that is a good thing and a bad thing as well. I think over time, Russia will fall apart. Once the eastern parts of the country get developed, they're going to break away, and there's no way of holding on to that. But in the short term, what we have is a power in land-loving leader in Russia, and we have a clash of two prodigiously large egos. The problem with Trump is he tends to wear his ego on his sleeve, right? Whenever he's interviewed or talks, first person singular pronoun comes into play almost every sentence, right? Even talking about the fires in California, he said, if you had listened to me 6 years ago, this never would have happened. Again, how often has he said the Ukraine war never would have happened if Donald Trump was in office? And Putin, in a relatively recent interview at night, even came to agree with that. So, yeah, sure, Donald Trump is right that the war would never have happened if he had been president. So Putin smartly blamed everything on Joseph Biden. And if that's not kissing up to Trump, I don't know what is. That's a big smarminess, ass kissing, and so forth. Trump has to be careful about that. He has a large ego, like I said, which he wears on the sleeve, and the difficulty is that he needs to see that Putin is just playing him. He's pandering towards Trump's ego. In other words, if they could come to the table, where the hell would they meet in the first place? Because Putin is afraid of going anywhere. He's afraid of taking in any liquid or eating any food, lest he be poisoned or something. He certainly is not wanted anywhere outside of Russia. He would be afraid to go anywhere if the talks were not held in Russia. So they'd have to be held somewhere in Russia. And it's not even clear that he would himself attend the negotiations, but might send a proxy or something, perhaps a doppelganger. I don't know, but as I said, I think Putin has no desire to come to the negotiation table. If he does come to the negotiation table, he's not going to concede anything, right? And even Trump's initial plan of making the acquired lands that Russia has acquired, a certain amount of territory, maybe some 20% of Ukraine in the south, the four oblasts, and Crimea, that these will not be Russian lands, but they will not be Ukrainian lands. They'll be sort of like a no man's land to be protected by NATO or European troops, British troops, right? Trump does not want America to cover the costs for having some 80,000 troops or so to guard the border. And that's not going to happen for Putin, right? Putin, and if it does happen, that's a win for Putin. It's like saying, a gang robs a bank and they steal $1 million, and it's hard to access this gang. If we swarm the gang at their hideout, that a certain number of invaders are going to be killed. So there's some risk involved. So we negotiate and say, yeah, you stole $1 million. We'll let you keep 20% of that, but you need to return the rest. And we give our word on that, and we're true to that. Of course, the bank robbers win. That sets a bad precedent for the future. I mean, what is China going to think of that, right? What will Iran think in other certain countries? It's basically telling a leader with villainous ideas is that if you do something bad, we're going to get a slap on the wrist. We're not going to do anything. Moreover, Putin is obsessed with acquisition of Ukraine. And the acquisition of Ukraine has been going on for a long time, back when Zaporozhian Cossacks occupied land in the Dnipro River and formed a state with Bohdan Khmelnytsky in 1648 through a war with Poland that proved to be very successful. Why Khmelnytsky didn't go all the way and invade Warsaw is a question I address in my book, Ukraine, The Deep Roots of a Young Nation, which will be coming out soon. That would have, and at some point, Ukraine was just situated in such a poor spot, mainly flat land, grassy land, without a lot of rainfall, that is difficult to defend. It's easily walked. One can make one's way through very easily over the plains. It's not a very easily defended land. So, geographically, Ukraine's in a bad spot. It always has been. And it was in the middle of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the west, Russia to the east and to the north, and of course the Tatars, right, the Muslim Tatars to the south, and the Turks as well. And at some point, it could not survive once the Cossack nation, the Hetmanate, became a sort of a state could not survive without having a treaty with one of the three powers. It formed treaties with Poland, Lithuania. Those did not work. Poland always, when it revitalized its army, came back and attacked the Ukrainians. There were several, and this was Khmelnytsky's genius, is that to forge an alliance with the Tatars and Turks, which is why he was so successful in 1648 thereafter. But that didn't work for the Ukrainians because they were devout Orthodox Christians and the Turks were not. And they saw themselves as doing forging alliances with infidels, with non-Christians, and it didn't work in the long term. And also on three separate occasions when there were great wars between Ukraine, the Cossacks, and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Turks literally walked out of the war right in the middle of it and left the Ukrainians on their own. And the Turks supplied most of the men on horse to lead the charge. And in spite of what people think, is that the Cossacks mainly attacked, either on rivers and boats or as foot soldiers, not on horses. Horses were expensive to have, and very few people had horses. So they forged the Treaty of Pereyaslav at 1654, an alliance with Russia. And Russia took that as a great event. Today, they still mark it as a great event. Khrushchev in 1954, when he marked the 300th anniversary, gave Crimea to Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union at the time. It was a gestural gift, not a gift of great significance, because Ukraine at the time was considered the foremost republic of the USSR, the satellite republic, as it were. And it was considered, as it were, a part of the Soviet Union. And if you want to think of it as ethnically Russian, I think Moscow, the Muscovites probably thought of Ukraine as ethnically Russian at the time. So it's not like they're ceding anything of significance. It's like someone in a family giving a son something or a daughter something, and But Putin makes a lot of this, that this was passed on and this was done illicitly. He had there was no business in handing over the Crimea, so the Crimea was still Russian, and as well as the Donbass areas, Donetsk and Luhansk, and these were not legitimately Ukrainian lands. And matter of speaking, Putin really thinks that Ukraine, he said, not too long ago, Ukraine's not, a few years ago, Ukraine's not even a country, right? It's not a polity. There's nothing to Ukraine. So it really always considered it as part of the Russian Empire. He thought that if you read the chronicles carefully, Kiev Rus, right, back in the 9th century AD, right, Kiev Rus really was that empire which stretched from Ukraine all the way to the north and touched upon the Baltic Sea and so forth, was really early Russia. He thought that Rus spoke a variety of early Russian, which is really not true. And he thought that there was a great unity to this polity, which also is not true. There are a lot of different cities held by princes who were in the line of Rurik, right, of Varangian. And so in some sense, there were bloodlines between the princes of all the different states, but they were spread out. And there was, after the reign of Yaroslav, the Wise, there were constant wars between the princes. So, and they were separated and they merged with different tribes. And there was a lot of intermixing in Moscow, for instance, and in the northern parts of Kiev Rus with Mongols and so forth, and people in different parts mixed with different tribes in the area and so forth. So there were similarities in the language spoken, but there are also differences in the language. So the whole notion that Putin's notion that Russia really can trace its roots back to Kiev, which was the central city in Kiev Rus, and that's a canard. That's a false story that Putin has whipped up. I think he really believes it's true, but it's a story he's whipped up to sort of justify his aggressive behavior on behalf of Ukraine. He does have this obsession with Ukraine. But I mentioned the difficulty and the danger is he's kissing up to Trump. One thing, Sergei Ilarionov has mentioned that, you know, Putin, for whatever his faults, is not a fool. He does his homework. He's a meticulous planner, and he listens to. He's not as I would say, he's not an ideologue. He's not a philosopher. He's not wedded to a single political ideal like liberty or centralized power, even though he does have that, but he's wedded to restoring Russia to its former greatness, and that is greatness of a military sort by acquiring other polities, other states. I find what I find uniquely paradoxical and somewhat strange is that Russia, for centuries, has had this obsession, this passion for conquest. And yet, when they conquer, and they're very good at it, they endure in battle, even though they suffer great losses, as we see in this war. They conquer, but they never, none of the tsars, Putin, for example, too, as president, never seems to concern himself one bit, one whit, about the well-being of the Russian people, especially the lower class of Russian people who are really pawns in his game. So one thing we need to worry about in this chess match that concerns me, with the latest move, move that Trump made rather boldly, he said, well, Putin needs to come to the table. Zelensky wants to come to the table. He's willing to do that. Putin doesn't seem so. He goes, I would do that because it's in his best interest. The economy is struggling. And he's right. The economy is struggling. He's losing so many of his soldiers. Close to 800,000 soldiers have died. They're dying at a rate of 1,500 a day. That can't be sustained. So Trump says, you can do it the easy way, or you can do it the hard way. And that was on the chessboard, that was a pretty bold, audacious move. Putin's come back with a move of his own that is, talked about quite a bit. I don't think it's well understood. It's a move to block Zelensky from negotiations. He wants negotiations to be between himself and Trump. And he's been doing his best to butter up Trump so that if they do negotiate somehow, he's going to get his way. Negotiation for Trump just means, here are my demands, and they need to be met. Otherwise, boom, the war continues. So he's been sucking up. And his great move lately has been, well, Zelensky can't negotiate because he's illegitimate. They needed to have another presidential election. They did not. Because of the war, it's understandable. So the fact that Zelensky keeps on as the president of Ukraine, Putin says he's doing it illegitimately. It's a clever move, of course, but it doesn't show any illegitimacy. It's a clever move to keep Zelensky out of negotiations, because Zelensky is going to be adamant that all the lands, Crimea and the four oblasts that have been invaded, be returned to Ukraine. And Putin's going to insist that they're not. They become part of Russia. So if we remove Zelensky from the bargaining table, we have an enormous advantage for Putin. And Trump might think he doesn't care about having Zelensky at the bargaining table either, but that's a bad move. As I said before, any concessions to Putin is a win, an enormous win for Russia, right? We know China has aims at acquisition of territory itself. Is the Chinese president going to act on that if things go favorably for Putin? So, we have this great chess match. Who's going to win? A week ago, I would say, was in the advantage of Trump, and now I think Putin's made a pretty clever move. When I say clever, it doesn't mean that it's a morally valid move. It's a facinerous, it's an evil move. But one needs to know something about Putin. He does his homework, right? He knows what's going on. He knows Trump's ego. He's going to pander to Trump's ego to get what he wants, right? He is perfectly, meticulously prepared for the moves that he makes, and he thinks them through. He takes advice from several different people, thinks them through. Trump does not. Trump is of the habit of saying something without even knowing what he's saying. Again, the forest fires and letting the water from dams come in as he thinks that's going to settle the forest fires. It's not. Um, he makes bold claims, loud claims without thoroughly thinking through a situation. Consider, for example, going to end the war in one day. Before I become president, all we need to do, Zelensky sit down, uh, Putin sit down, let's talk, we'll end the war. Well, that sounds really wonderful. It fails to consideration. It fails to put into consideration the long history between Russia and Ukraine of incivility, of violence, of warring, the long history of Russia oppressing Ukraine. I have a book on Holodomor, on it's called Whisk of the Red Broom, Stalin in Ukraine from 1928 to 1933, when Stalin attempted to collectivize all the farms in Russia and the farms in Ukraine because of all the great grains that they grow. There are cereals, wheat, rye, barley, and so forth. And he, using the model that he used to in his first 5-year plan to sort of collectivize industry in the cities of eastern Ukraine and throughout Russia, there was great improvement in output, even though quality control wasn't handled very well. Machines were overworked, laborers were overworked, but they did. Russian industry did considerable output with respect to the needed goods, especially military goods, tractors for farms and so forth. But they wanted to use Stalin wanted to use the same sort of model that you might use in a factory with the supervisor and all people looking down. So they brought in, certain supervisors into Ukrainian farm area, the Ukrainian peasant farms of the villages, and wanted to collectivize them, make them put all the farms together in an area and have a sort of central governing agency and take away all the things that the Ukrainian people owned and make everything property of the state. And Ukrainians objected strenuously to that plan. And they should have considered someone buying a tractor and using a tractor, a peasant who is of sufficient means, like my grandfather, who was a peasant in Holowchak, and his father was well-to-do, was a builder. So they owned a lot of land and a decent-sized house for the village. Imagine, you buy this beautiful tractor, then here comes the state and says, we're going to take that from you. You don't give it to us, we're just going to take it anyway. If you object, we're going to ostracize you, or we're going to throw you into a gulag somewhere, perhaps in Siberia, or we're going to shoot you. A few people shot in the head at the right time worked wonders to convince peasants to collectivize. So there was great famine going on as brigadiers came in, were stealing grain from the Ukrainian people. They worked on the assumption that was true early on, that the Ukrainian peasant farmers were not willing to sell their grain to the state for a small fraction of its worth. They put it on the black market and tried to sell it there, and that made Stalin angry. So they brought in the stormtroopers, as it were, and they stole as much grain, and they wound up stealing everything until in 1932, there was an enormous famine and stretched on into 33, early into 33, and 4 million some Ukrainians died, as well as other people who were subject to collectivization. But anyway, we have this sort of top-down model that's been practiced in the Soviet Union as well as in Putin's Russia. He was supposed to be a Democrat right when he came to power in 2000, but nothing like that has even ever taken shape. So we have these negotiations, presumably, that might happen. I initially thought delay would be a strong point for Trump. Why do I say that? Because Putin habitually comes late to meetings in the manner of Stalin. Stalin, when he first met Lenin, uh, remarked, well, he's very ordinary. And there he is talking to someone, another ordinary person. A great leader should not look, and he's not large. He should be large. Stalin himself was only 5'6", and he was physically deformed. But, Stalin talked of this notion. A great man enters the room late, keeps everybody waiting, because that's what greatness does. And when it enters to applause. And if I remember correctly, Putin actually kept the Queen of England waiting at one time and kept the Pope waiting for a significant amount of time. He wants to be the last person in. So I thought in some psychological sense, and psychology comes into play massively here with these two egos. Making Trump wait pisses off Trump, right? It's like saying, I'm more important than you are. I'm coming in later. And Putin is playing the game now. It says, well, Zelensky's not legitimate. And the legitimacy claim is also polysemous. I think it means more than just he's not legitimate as president because he wasn't elected. He's not legitimate as president because he's a Jew. Stalin had Putin had something to say about that before, but he doesn't play that card anymore. He doesn't make that move because he recognizes it's a non-starter. It's not going to gain him anything. But Putin is patient. He will wait to get his way. Any sort of territorial acquisition is a win for him. He doesn't want the war to end anyway. I've been consistent with that for a number of reasons. One, if the war should end, Putin has to come face to face with a decimated, more than that, a moribund Russian economy. I've got my cat here, Viscount Fingal, on my desk. Right, Fings? You agree with that? But he doesn't want the war to end because if it ends, he's got to come to face with a moribund Soviet economy where inflation might be up to 30%. People are suffering. Families are losing loved ones in the war. Like we said, some 800,000 people have already died, in spite of the fact that Putin denies that. And troops are dying on a daily basis, and he's making small territorial gains as I speak to you right now. These are gains that will not be able to be defended in the long term, we know, because the economy is crippled and the number of soldiers are going down. He is, according to one account, has invested 90% of the Russian soldiery, of the infantry, of all his troops and stuff in Ukraine, makes him vulnerable any sort of uprisings or attacks anywhere else in Russia. And Russia is a very large land. What needs to happen here? Trump has to be wise enough to understand that Putin is playing him. And Trump can play. The scary part about Trump is he wants to force NATO and European nations to do their part to help Ukraine. And he's right to say that. There's no question of that. But the point is he can't abandon the situation. He's the most important player. That's why I said this is a chess match between Trump and Putin. Western nations, the nations of Europe will do as Trump pretty much says. And if he's going to back away from NATO, withdraw the United States from NATO, or not help, right? Just say the hell with it. We got this ocean. This really doesn't concern us. It does, because you're giving the war to Putin in the short term. He's going to revitalize his army and he's going to come back for Ukraine. We know from 2023, there was I think a 17-page report leaked out that talked about the plan of Russia to acquire Belarus that leaked out to the Belarusian president. And he was a puppet of Putin and was pissed off a bit and remarked that, no, we're going to be a sovereign state. Russia does not have. So we know that Russia wants to go back in, take Ukraine, after Ukraine, Belarus, then he's going to go to the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and perhaps Finland after that, right? There's tension there. There was tension between Charles XII and Peter the Great in the Great Northern War, right? That Russia won at the expense of Sweden and relegated Sweden to a second-class military nation thereafter. So there's this whole series of tensions here. Trump is the most important figure. He has at his advantage his great unpredictability. That's a large asset. Don't underestimate that. But it also, and he's using that, I think, to force NATO, to force the Western nations of Europe to come to the table and do their part to support Ukraine in the war. The notion is, and I'll end with this is not, if Putin is very, very militarily, economically vulnerable, he's using second-rate equipment to fight the war, tanks that had been not used since 60 years. His supply of troops, he's drawing from North Korea these days, 12,000 men or so. Perhaps they're going to get more soon. He's very vulnerable. This is the time to strike. This is the time decisively to win the war. That needs to be done. The United States needs to go all in concert with the NATO nations and just destroy Putin. And Putin needs to be eliminated. If he's conceded and given these lands, all he's going to do, go back, it'll be a win. Putin's popularity rate, he's never a very popular person, but his popularity is generally pretty high because he creates situations of danger for the Russian people. He rules by fear, right? Chechens coming into when he's elected president, Chechens coming in and bombing apartment blocks. There's evidence that the Russian people themselves, the Russian government itself, was responsible for murdering some 300 people in 4 or so bombings when Putin became president. So there were perhaps, and I think it's very likely, he was killing Russian people just so Putin can come like Superman to the rescue and say, we're not going to tolerate this from Chechnya. And he becomes a hero in the eyes of the Russian people because he saves them from these bombings, even though he probably was responsible for them himself. And then he all in on the Chechens, right? Go to war and just eliminate these people as these pestiferous people. So critical point here. The United States, Trump needs to play the Trump card. He needs to go all in, and we need to just annihilate Putin and the Russian army right now while they're in a very vulnerable state, right? So it's all in. The final move is by Trump. If he makes a move towards any sort of concession toward Putin, right? Putin's going to reinvigorate the army. He'll come back later and do it again if he lives that long. But there's no question of that. It's a win. Any sort of walking to the table, conceding anything is a win for Putin, right? And anyway, no matter what claims and concessions he verbally makes, he won't honor them. He has a history of not honoring his claims, right? Concerning the treaties made after he attacked Donbass and so forth in 2014, the 2 treaties he violated both, of course. He never had any intention of honoring them. A video by Richard Nixon, prior to Putin, well prior to Putin's presidency, he says, when I had intercourse with Russian diplomats and so forth, one thing when you talk with them is don't take anything they say literally. Dishonesty, honesty in negotiation is just not part of their DNA. Anyways, that's all I want to say. Again, the video here was a matter of trying to look at the situation as a sort of chess game. I'm not trying to dehumanize the criminality involved in the war and the sanguinary actions, the bloodshed and the loss of human lives, especially by Ukrainians, and the terrorist acts that were committed, bombing of hospitals and kidnapping of children and so forth. So I'm not minimizing minifying that by comparing this to a chess match, but I'm mainly trying to emphasize that we need to get into the minds of the 2 most important players here, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, if we want to understand just how the war should end. And it needs to end when one army or the other defeats that other. And The United States needs to go all in at that point. Anyways, Colonel Holowchak, Polkovnik, and signing out here, and I'll post another video soon. Take care.